I think it goes without saying that video games in general have a very close relationship with guns. The concept just works so well, you just point and shoot. If you were to ask someone to name any 3 games, chances are they would probably name a game that contains a gun. In fact, a lot of the most popular games this year have been first-person shooters. Call of Duty Warzone and Doom Eternal come to mind. Now when we consider non-VR games, guns are basically as simple as point and shoot. The guns in Half-Life 2, which you can see in the background, are just this. You look around with the mouse or a joystick, and then press a button to shoot. Other games, say for example Valorant, utilize a concept called bloom, where the accuracy of your weapon goes down as you continue to fire it. This introduces an element of skill, in which you must learn to pace your shots for optimal accuracy. Many other games have their own ways of making their guns feel unique and satisfying to use. However, people may complain about how guns feel and handle in flat games, and many developers try to fine-tune their weapons to make them feel as good as possible in the hands of players, but it's not always perfect. A reload might be too slow, or the weapon may be slow to draw. This is where virtual reality comes in. In VR, you are completely in control of the object in your hands. You can reload a VR gun at your own pace, whether that be as slow or as fast as possible, and the speed at which you can draw said weapon is only limited by how fast you can actually move your hands. All these changes that a virtual reality gun bring about may sound good on the surface, but there is another underlying issue that actually works to VR's detriment. When you use a gun in a flat game, the body of your character exists in a plane that you control with exterior inputs. You don't need to worry about shouldering the weapon properly, since the person you're playing as has already done that. It's just your job to pull the trigger. In virtual reality, you are the person you're playing as, and you must shoulder your own weapon properly. Keep in mind, this weapon, this VR gun that you're holding, doesn't physically exist. Consequently, there is nothing to rest your shoulder against and steady your aim. To alleviate this issue, people buy things like gun stocks, devices that act as a surrogate stock for you to shoulder like a real gun, but not everyone has, can afford, or wants to use these devices. In turn, VR shooter developers program their guns to feel and act a certain way, so that people not using gun stocks have a good experience playing the game. Some games, like Superhot VR, choose not to even bother featuring two-handed weapons in their games for the sake of all guns feeling good to use, as handling a one-handed gun is basically as easy as pointing a TV remote. Bottom line, some games do VR guns well, some not so much, and when bad handling on part of a developer gets in your way, it can lead to a bad experience. Today we will look at what makes VR guns tick, what doesn't, and how we can combine the features of 3 different games to create the ideal virtual reality firearm. One of the things that distinguish guns from one another is the way that they look. Everyone can look at this weapon and say, that's a Tommy gun, or this weapon and say, that's an M16. But if you're not familiar with guns, you probably won't be able to differentiate a rifle from a pistol with just sound or any other factors. Now, Gun Club VR is a game that doesn't need to worry about dedicating resources to AI or seamless multiplayer. In case you didn't know, Gun Club is essentially a simulator game for guns. You're dropped into a firing range with a gun of your choosing and you shoot targets. That's basically the extent of it. So why is it one of the most played VR games that I have? The visuals. Like I said before, this game is excruciatingly simple, so it doesn't take all that much to process its mechanics. This means there is a lot of spare processing power to render great visuals. As you've probably seen in the gameplay playing in the background right now, Gun Club VR's arsenal is enhanced by reflections and proper lighting on everything, from the stocks of shotguns to the bullet casings of SMGs. These reflections, combined with high quality, highly detailed models, lead to a realistic and visceral looking firearm. You might be thinking that live reflections on weapons aren't really that big of a deal, since they've been in flat games for ages and basically all PC VR games have them. And you'd be partly right. The reason I designated the visuals of a VR gun as the least important is because it's simply a cosmetic feature. It doesn't affect the gameplay in any way, nor does it positively affect you besides looking cool. What I'm trying to say is that it's not completely vital, especially in games that are running on limited hardware, like the Quest, which is what I'm basing this video off of. I would happily trade good visuals for better handling any day. Gun Club is also my least favourite game out of all the games I'll be mentioning today. That's not because it's a bad game, quite the opposite really. It's because, due to its content and premise, it's pretty limited. Even when the guns look great and mostly feel great, shooting cardboard targets gets bland after a while. Oh yeah, and I said the guns mostly feel great. This tends to be the case with many other things in the game. Most of the rifles feel great, but the pump actions and the bolt actions just feel awful. I constantly find myself accidentally pumping at the wrong time or grabbing the stock of a bolt action and collapsing it when I'm actually just trying to prime it. As for sound, there are some guns that stand out, like this TMP. And some guns that, well, just listen to this. And although it doesn't sound the greatest, I love this MP5. Although unfortunately, you can't put a grenade launcher on it. Point is, it's Gun Club's visuals that are the standout feature that put it onto this list of criteria. The reflections bring a new sense of presence to the table that makes these virtual guns step closer to their real-life counterparts. At this point, you've probably picked up what the next two criteria will be, so let's get straight into the next one. Here's a clip from the YouTube channel Washington County Machine Guns. To anyone who loves guns, these clips are probably music to your ears, and there's a reason for that. I would say it's pretty much unanimously agreed that guns sound awesome, and that a bad or weak sounding gun in any sort of media, not just video games, drastically takes away from the experience. However, the way a gun sounds when it shoots is not the only thing that matters. Great Foley sound effects are just as important as a beefy sounding gunshot. There's a reason why the famous shotgun pump and the M1 Garand ping are so iconic. Long story short, gun foley should sound like clean metal scraping together, not someone chewing on a bottle cap lid. Now I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not that big of a fan of Onward. I find the gameplay to be slow and boring, although admittedly it does have its moments. When the gun game playlist was in rotation, I was playing at least 10 matches a day and winning at least 9 of them. So I don't not like the game because I'm bad at it. That'd be stupid. I was one of the people who bought it the day that it came out, and I had so much fun with Gun Game that I didn't even play the core game modes until about 2 weeks after launch. But unfortunately, after I had played a couple matches, I started to feel bored, and afterwards I never touched it again. I guess it's just not my kind of game. Although the core gameplay never struck me as anything overly notable, the sound effects certainly did. The gritty, realistic gunshot and Foley sound effects line up with the game's realistic milsim take on the shooter genre. The guns sound great in the player's hands and are mixed extremely well. All the weapons that should boom do so without maxing out your headphones and producing that annoying buzz. There isn't really any way I can describe the sounds to you that is better than just letting you listen to them, so here's a couple of my favorite guns and their accompanying sound effects. Now, as you can see in the gameplay, the aforementioned reflections are not present in Onward. This is likely because the maps are a lot larger than a typical shooter map and therefore require more processing power to render all at once. This is not a big deal though. You may feel about sound effects the way I do about graphics, that they don't affect the gameplay and are just a novelty that, if done well, can add to the experience. But there is far more good sound design can do than just make the game sound more realistic. Good sound design can immerse you. Ambient effects add to the atmosphere of an environment and make you feel more present in the world. Good sound design can inform you. In situations where you can't look at whatever HUD you may have, a loud ping or alert tone can inform you of information that is vital for you to know at that time. The alarm that plays in Halo when your shield drops, or the beeps that play when you're low on ammo in Half-Life 2. When you're in the middle of a heated situation where you've got to be looking anywhere other than your HUD, these sounds can be incredibly helpful. Now the handling. Onward by far has the worst two-handed weapon handling of any VR shooter I've ever played. I remember specifically saying to my friend how floaty the guns felt. This is further accentuated by the fact that the game includes an aggressively easy to use virtual stock that basically glues the gun to your eyeball. You don't even have to move your trigger hand when manipulating the weapon. Your offhand controls where the muzzle is pointing, and moving your trigger hand away from your body just leads to the virtual stock disengaging. The reason this virtual stock sucks is because it makes things far too easy. It's only fun for a little while when you get into gunfights where you're basically lasering your enemy while they trace an outline of you. The appeal of a gunfight, especially in VR games, is who will have the skill to outplay their opponent. The outcome of these gunfights should never come down to who out of the two of you actually opened up the settings page and had a look around. I'll elaborate on what I mean by floaty in the third criteria, but just know for now, if you're looking for a realistic VR shooter, Onward will surprise you with all its other features, but disappoint you with its rendition of its genre's staple. There is one final game that anyone who owns an Oculus Quest has likely played and definitely heard of. It is also the game on this list with the best weapon handling, decent sound design, and also nice looking models. It also crashes at the worst possible times and almost bricked my Quest once. In real life, when you handle a firearm, you have one hand on the receiver or trigger and one hand supporting the end of the weapon. Whether you're holding onto some grip of some kind, or your hand is simply sitting on the underside of the barrel, the general stance your hands and arms assume basically stays the same while firing and idly handling. So how does this relate back to Pavlov? Let me answer your question with another question. Have you ever tried to shoot yourself? In VR, of course. If you tried to shoot yourself with a rifle in Onward, you'd find that you'd be able to turn the muzzle of the gun towards your face with extreme ease. If you tried doing the same in Pavlov or Gun Club, you'd find that you're not able to turn or rotate the gun any more than around 130 degrees while it's in your hands. So why is this? Well, these two games implement something I call simulated arm and hand presence. To explain what I mean, I'll be using this dinky little toy G36C I bought 2 years ago for some reason. As you can see, when I put my hands in the position I would be in if I were firing a real gun, my elbows are positioned in a way that stops me from being able to turn my arms any more than 130 degrees. The position of my hands physically doesn't allow it unless I were to break my arms. This is why I describe the guns in Onward as feeling floaty. It feels like the gun is floating on my controllers instead of being attached to my controllers and having a fixed orientation. If the muzzle is above the controller's trigger and the barrel runs along the tracking ring, it should maintain that orientation and not move when I orient my controllers. This is a concept I've tried explaining to my friends so many times when they ask me why I'm complaining about floaty guns. So hopefully you understand what I mean. Obviously you won't be able to fully understand what I mean unless you've played both games yourself. But maybe you prefer it this way, maybe it doesn't even bother you, but it bothers me. Enough to the point where going and playing other games feels jarring because it doesn't have this simulated arm and hand presence. I have to stop myself from getting excited for new games, namely the new Medal of Honor, simply because if the game doesn't have this feature, I know I won't be able to enjoy it or be able to be as competitive as I'd like to be. Another thing I should mention is the use of proper hand posing. This is one thing that Pavlov and Gun Club has, but Onward curiously doesn't. What I mean by this is when you grab onto the priming handle of a weapon, your virtual hand will physically grip it. I bet there was a handful of you that didn't even notice that this was happening, but I bet now that I've shown you, you'll see it every time you prime a VR gun. It's the little things like this that sell a VR gun. Even if it doesn't make sense, when your virtual hand grabs the bolt, even if your real hand isn't doing it, you subconsciously ignore it because that's what would happen in real life. And as anyone who avidly plays VR would know, simply being in an environment and seeing your hands is enough to convince your subconscious that you're really in the place that you're seeing. Why do you think people get motion sick in VR? In the end, Pavlov isn't a perfect game. The community is unsavory, and the game crashes a lot, interestingly when I'm doing good for some reason. But the things it gets right, it absolutely nails. The sound effects are pretty good for what they are, if you ignore their stockiness. The models look pretty decent too, and even though they don't have live reflections, they still look nice under certain lighting conditions. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. One thing that Onward does so much better than Pavlov is grenades. Grenades in Pavlov barely work. I mean, there isn't even smoke effects when the frag explodes, and this flashbang literally does nothing. It's even more odd when you find out that in Pavlov's most recent updates, these smoke grenades here were added, but they don't even do anything. Anyway, on to the conclusion. Visuals, sounds, and handling. 3 things that we've explored and discovered how they impact the feeling and gameplay of a VR gun. Going into this video, I didn't really know if I was going to be able to properly articulate how I felt about certain things, but I found it was pretty easy to get my thoughts out once I started talking about it, and you should do the same. Talk with members of the VR community about what makes a VR gun feel great to you. Remember, this is all just my opinion of how these weapons should feel. If you think Onward's guns feel great, let me know in the comments. If you agree with me, tell me. And if we want to send a message to VR developers, the best way is to talk about it. But for now, my name is Doreen, and this was how to make a virtual rifle feel good.